Robot Talk is the podcast that sits down with robot enthusiasts from around the world and asks them the questions you always wanted answered. Like, can the robot dance? And how does that thing work? Hello everyone, welcome to Robot Talk. I'm your host, Claire Asher, and this week we're focusing on robots in dance and the two-way relationship between engineering and the arts. But first, I'd like to remind you to subscribe to Robot Talk through your favourite podcast provider to make sure you're the first to hear the latest episodes. Another way to find out about new episodes is the email newsletter, which you can sign up to by going to robottalk.org. This weekend, I'll be hosting a live episode of the podcast as part of the Great Exhibition Road Festival in London. I'll be chatting to three fascinating guests about humanoid robots, why we're captivated by them, and what roles they could play in our future societies. I've popped the event link in the episode description. Hope to see you there. So, without further ado, it's time for me to introduce this week's guest. I recently had a really interesting chat with Amy LaViers from the Robotics, Automation and Dance Lab about the creative relationship between humans and machines. Today, I'm speaking to Amy LaViers, Director of the Robotics, Automation and Dance Lab, a non-profit organisation for art making, commercialization, education, outreach and research. Hi Amy, welcome to Robot Talk.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So you're working on one of the more unusual areas of robotics that I've covered on the podcast. So can you start off by telling us a little bit about your career path and how you came to work in robotics and dance?
Well, it was a Thursday, and it was the last Thursday of my junior year of college. Okay. And I was taking these two classes. One in the morning was my control class. Control systems is a class mechanical engineers take to study how machines move. And I couldn't have even put that sentence together on that Thursday. I was like barely getting through this course. And my professor, it was the last lecture, he did this big kind of glorious, like tie everything together lecture where he talked about the unrideable bicycle, which is a bike that I think was developed at MIT. And when you twist the handlebars, instead of twisting the front wheel, it twists the back wheel. So this is called an unrideable bike. And it's extraordinarily hard to control. You have to practice for years. People can do it, but you have to practice for years. Whereas the other design of a bicycle,
quite intuitive.
Well, he showed us, Professor Rowley shows us the root locus and the stability margins and talks about the different dynamics. And all of a sudden, the pieces we had been studying that semester clicked or to an extent, because I could imagine being on a system that I couldn't control with my body. I could imagine and kinesthetically relate to this idea of a system that was harder to balance, because I thought about balance a lot in my other classes. Like later that afternoon, I went to my course on dance writing, and there we were watching a video of Twyla Tharp. She was being interviewed, and she starts talking about the difference in her work. She's choreographed a lot with classical ballet and also with more contemporary forms like modern. And she's talking about the different stabilities, I think she uses the term inherent stability of the home position in ballet, which is when you stick your heels together and point your toes out. And modern, where you stand with each foot parallel to one another right underneath your hips. And she talks about how this position in modern is very stable. It's comfortable. But then if you want to move, you really have to shift your weight and take this big weight shift to move On the other hand, in ballet, when you're in this teetery position with your heels touching and your toes pointing out, and it's a little bit hard to balance, your weight is completely prepared for shifting side to side, left to right. And she just says, and those home positions, those different stabilities lead to these different forms for me. You know, she's talking about her work. Yeah. And it was so beautifully put. It was so incredibly insightful. And it took me back to the unrideable bike. And it took me back to, oh my gosh, root locus. Yeah, we could study those stability margins. I could quantify that. And really what you do in what I did in my dance program at college at Princeton, we were always writing papers about dance. We were always doing this sort of qualitative analysis, and I loved it. It was, transformative for me to think about and write about and have this academic posture towards dance. And so I thought, well, we could do some quantitative analysis of that. And I had this senior thesis looming over my head that I had to do the next year. And I just started talking to people and got lots of help and lots of input. And I met my PhD advisor. I mean, you just start talking, you just send one email, right? And you say, hey, I want to do a senior thesis on X and Y. And then, oh, you should talk to this person. You should talk to this person. Let me introduce you to this. Like, it just was this unfolding thing. And I'm still unfolding it. And I'm still sending those emails. And hey, I get, so that's how it got started. And it's really, I'm still working on it now. And I'm still feel like that student who's just trying to figure out the very next immediate step.
Yeah. I mean, that's a fantastic story. I think it's wonderful that you were able to really combine these two, engineering and arts in your studies, because what I hear from so many people working in science and working in engineering and robotics is that you don't get much exposure to the arts and the creative side of things in that education. And I think that's, I've talked about this a few times on the podcast. I think that's a real loss, that there isn't more of a conversation between these two areas that are seen as so far from each other, but there are such interesting connections between them.
Yeah, and there's a huge overlap. I mean, it may be relatively rare in some sense. I understand what you're saying, but there's also still a lot of people who do work at this intersection. And, what you're describing, unfortunately, engineering programs, they lobotomize anything but engineering. I think you have to, at Princeton, you had to take more classes and you got fewer electives. And so I know nothing about history, okay, because I was doing all my electives were my dance classes, and I don't speak any other languages, and don't ask me about philosophy or like politics, don't know. And it's tough because I learned a lot for sure about engineering. I think for me, it was a lot more like it took grad school. It took like up to the master's before I could fully digest everything they were trying to tell me, or even half of what they were trying to tell me in undergrad, because it's so compact, it's so intense. And you end up with engineers who have narrower expertise than I think is appropriate for the undergrad level. But, I'm not one of the decision makers on that front, but
no. So, fast forward to now, you're director of the Robotics, Automation and Dance, or RAD lab. Can you tell me about some of the projects you're working on at the moment?
So we have kind of one big main focus at the moment, which is a National Science Foundation grant that is collaborative with Penn State and University of Illinois Chicago. And this is an AI infrastructure grant where we're developing a system that will house large data sets of annotated human movement. Okay. So this is interesting for people, for example, some of my collaborators who want to study how emotion is manifest and expressed through movement. Or in the future, we might have people who are studying golf swings, and you want to create a huge data set of golf swings. So now I'm kind of in the flip side, right? Like before, I was interested in bringing quantitative tools to movement. And in this project, we're almost taking quantitative measures of movement and annotating them with humans. What are humans finding salient about these? What do these motions mean? What are the lay impressions? And we're using expert movement annotators who are trained in forms of movement notation to look at, in a more detailed manner, what's going on and what do people perceive about these behaviors. And so we're trying to create data almost marketplace where that can happen for researchers to share their annotations, to share their data, to use and find data in annotations, to drive their algorithm design. So I like to compare it to, the internet is this huge repository of symbolically labeled movement. What I'm doing right now, vocalizing, is body movement, and we have a really good, robust system for annotating it. If you were to transcribe your podcast, then that's this notation of what happened in our conversation. Yeah. And we're thinking about the gestures and postures, which you're seeing as I move. We're talking on Zoom, so you can see my broader bodily movement that's not making as much sound. So that's the part that we're trying to develop a database of to drive robotics and AI and give that broader picture into human movement, and try to study it and try to analyze it and try to notate it and try to understand why sometimes it looks different, which is that same question that Twyla Tharp's put me on.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating.
That's our main project. The other thing, we are also developing some of our outreach activities, and actually I'm hoping to open a physical space at the end of the summer where we'll have kind of a gallery and classroom space and maybe some event space. So I brought my lab out of academia, and so we're kind of back in startup mode, and we've got the research column well established, and now we're starting to broaden out to some of these other areas that were pared back as I got everything set up again.
Sure. Well, yeah, that's really exciting. Humanoid robots often don't move in a very human way. And I guess a lot of that is constricted by engineering constraints rather than, a deliberate design choice. But I do wonder whether if these humanoids moved in a more human way, we might find them less creepy.
Well, I actually think that's two separate ideas there. Being humanoid, that's a word that makes me crazy. I don't know what a humanoid is.
Yeah.
Lots of humans don't have 4 limbs.
This is true, yeah.
And
a lot of humanoid robots have wheels, so...
Sure, wheels, and almost none of them have flexible cores. And so much of our both functional and expressive dimensions of our body are created through this.
Yeah.
I'm wiggling my spine, right? So what is humanoid? I don't know. But
That's fair.
I've seen a lot of blobs that move very convincingly, very, very appropriately, very human-like. So I don't know what human-like is either, right? If I don't know what human-like is, I also don't know what human-like means. But it's not so much about the form, but it is about, I think, moving in a way that's meaningful. And my favorite example of this is the HAL robot in 2001 Space Odyssey. It's just a blinking light, the quote-unquote body. It's just this blinking light. It's a voice. Yeah. We're going to ignore the voice for a second because we know how to notate that. But it's just this blinking light. And it's perfectly effective and meaningful and terrifying and all the things that the artists who made it wanted it to be. So I don't know. I try to be platform agnostic. I want to work with LEDs that just turn on and off, and I want to work with 39 armed octopi robots. I feel like it's important that I shouldn't care what the body looks like, because I've seen so many examples of expressive bodies that have nothing to do with the human form.
Yeah.
The ideal human form.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes complete sense. If someone says to you, humans dancing with robots, I guess the instinct as a lay person who's not working in this field is to imagine a humanoid, as you said, whatever that means.
So when I think of dancing with robots, there's a sort of twofold thing that happens in that picture. One is, as a dance artist, I can expand my palette. And I might choose to expand my palette with something, that's vaguely human-like looking. But I might want to expand my palette with something that's completely alien to what my body can do. And that's really intriguing as an artist. As a roboticist, the minute you try to dance with a robot, you realize how it is. There's 1,000 things you might improve. And that's not just my opinion. I mean, a lot of dancers who have worked with robots describe feeling very human afterwards. And what does that mean? I don't know. But you can develop better robots this way. And so that's the sort of bidirectionality that I'm fascinated in. Like every project I do, I want to be learning about dance and learning about robotics. And that's sort of my litmus test for if a project makes sense for me to take on.
Yeah. And so, I mean, that leads quite nicely into my next question, which is about, what are the challenges of working alongside robots in the performing arts?
Well, that's an interesting way of phrasing it. In the performing arts, so work that we produce that is a product that might be recognized as art by at least some people, they break all the time. It's extraordinarily stressful. And we do a lot of live performance. So it has to work live.
Yeah.
When people are scheduled to show up, and you can't push that an hour or a day like you could, a user study in a lab. And so that has created a lot of stress and failure around what we've done. And, a lot of academic roboticists, we don't, and that's largely what the lab is we're not making like products. And all the people that I know who have tried to make robotic products have failed because it's so hard to make something that's robust and that works when it needs to work. And so I think it would be a nice challenge to avoid. And a lot of labs avoid it by having user studies that run on their schedule or just needing one videotape where it worked or, but when you say at 5 p.m. on May 21st, we're going to be live at the Rialto Theater, which I'm not performing at that, but I have several colleagues who are showing work this coming next week. And like, they're all panicking, trying to get the robots to the theater on time, get the shipping, get everything set up, make sure you have your power cable, make sure the Wi-Fi is working, make sure, all those lists. So that's a challenge. And it can be a challenge for performing artists that we work with, to respect that we're developing something new. This robot that we're going to put on stage isn't like a lamp that we can just turn on and off that's going to work every time. It's something that's still in development. And so that creates a lot of vulnerability around the dancers who are working with the robots to say, okay, I'm game to be a little uncertain if the lamp is going to turn on or if it's going to flicker or if I'm going to have. So I think it's a challenge a lot of performing artists don't want to deal with. They want to use lamps that turn on and off. And so just like a lot of roboticists don't want to deal with a live performance where it has to start at 5 p.m. So, it's just I guess that's a challenge. That's probably the biggest one I would talk about. And in creating buy-in around like, okay, let's put aside some comfort that, everything's going to go smoothly in order to work with these novel, weird, developing, emerging devices.
Yeah, and I guess, if you're choreographing with a robot, especially if it's one that is really different from the human form, what is that like? How does that require you to put your brain in like a completely different way of thinking? How do you get into that space?
Oh, that's a really great question. And I've heard Monica Thomas, who worked with Boston Dynamics, answer it the way I feel like you're asking it. And so she would probably say, yes, like I did have to. And she's worked so intimately with those machines for so long that maybe she has a better answer than me. But to me, it's more like throw a little paint on the canvas, see what you see, iterate from there. Yeah. And so because I always have these ideas like, I want to make these like incredible, multifaceted, many different elements of movement wings. And then I try to build that and no, it's not that. Okay, well, now see what's on the canvas and move from there. And so it's about, trying something out, seeing how it moves and responding to it in the body and creating a composition that's reflective of what you were able to build, which is never what I've hoped to build. And which is the same when I paint. When I paint, I try to make a circle. Well, it's kind of more of an oval. Okay, well, my little turtle is going to be a little more, I'm looking at him from this angle now. Let me, you just constantly iterate from what shows up on the canvas or what shows up on the stage.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, a lot of, or perhaps all of your work is bringing together the arts and engineering. What benefits have you seen from doing that?
Oh, Maybe none. Maybe absolutely none. Maybe this is a bad idea. Not my job to answer that question above my pay grade. We'll see if it's useful.
Okay.
I'm experimental. I'm on some sort of leading edge, and I think it remains to be seen if it's something that anyone should be doing, or if anyone, you know what I mean? Like, I think I'm comfortable and I'm fine with being there. I think it's important that we have people who explore, and I feel like I'm an explorer.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. I mean, I think what you're doing is absolutely fascinating. So I'm glad you're doing it, if nothing else. Amy, it's been really fun chatting to you today. I've been talking to Amy LaViers from the Robotics, Automation and Dance Lab. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy Robot Talk, I'd really appreciate it if you could share the podcast, subscribe, and leave a review. It really helps boost the podcast, so thanks in advance. And don't forget to join the Robot Talk community on Patreon if you'd like to support the podcast and get access to some awesome perks, including behind-the-scenes updates and monthly bonus episodes. Visit patreon.com/Claire Asher to find out more. Next week, I'll be talking to Gabrielle Scancer from KTH Royal Institute of Technology about chatting with robots. Until then, I've been Claire Asher, and this has been Robot Talk. Robot Talk is brought to you by the Hamlin Centre, Imperial College London.